What if two of the most important figures in the Bible actually began as gods from ancient Sumer? Long before the book of Genesis was written, Mesopotamian civilizations worshipped Enki and Enlil, two powerful deities whose stories would later inspire one of the most controversial theories in alternative history. Some claim Enki became Lucifer, the bringer of forbidden knowledge, while Enlil evolved into Yahweh, the commanding god of the Old Testament. But is there any historical evidence connecting these figures? Or is this simply a modern reinterpretation of ancient myths? In this video, we investigate the origins of this fascinating theory and separate what ancient texts say from later speculation. There are two names buried in the oldest clay tablets ever pulled from the earth. Names older than Abraham, older than Moses, older than the word Israel itself. They are Enki and Enlil, two brothers, two gods, two rulers of the world, as the Sumerians understood it nearly 5,000 years ago. Almost no one outside a university classroom or a niche corner of the internet has heard these names spoken aloud, and yet a growing number of researchers, theologians, and independent scholars believe that these two forgotten figures are the true ancestors of the two most famous supernatural beings in the Western world. Yahweh, the God of the Bible, and Lucifer, the fallen angel who became the face of evil itself. This is not a small claim. If it holds even a grain of truth, it means that the moral architecture of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, the entire cosmic battle between good and evil that has shaped billions of lives, did not begin in a garden in Eden. It began on the floodplains of southern Iraq, in a civilization that invented writing itself, among a people who told stories about gods who breathed, argued, wept, plotted, and sometimes tried to destroy the very humans they had created. So we have to ask the question plainly, because it deserves a plain answer. Is Enki Lucifer? And if he is, what does that make Enlil? What does that make the god so many people pray to every single day? Over the next 20 minutes, we are going to walk through the oldest religious texts on Earth, compare them line by line with the stories in Genesis, and let the evidence speak for itself. Some of what you are about to hear is solid, well-documented Assyriology, the kind of thing you can find in any serious textbook on Mesopotamian religion. Some of it is speculative, the kind of pattern recognition that excites researchers precisely because it cannot be proven or disproven with the evidence we currently have. We will try to be honest about which is which as we go, because the story is compelling enough without exaggeration, and because the truth, whatever it turns out to be, matters more than the sensational version of it. Let's start with the people who first wrote these stories down, because you cannot understand the myths without understanding the minds that produced them. The Sumerians lived in the southern part of Mesopotamia, in the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in what is now Iraq, and they built the first cities the world had ever seen. Uruk, Eridu, Nippur, Ur. These were not villages. They were sprawling urban centers with irrigation systems, temple bureaucracies, standing armies, and a class of professional scribes who recorded everything from grain shipments to epic poetry on wet clay using a wedge-shaped stylus. This writing system, cuneiform, is the oldest form of writing ever discovered, predating Egyptian hieroglyphics in its developed form, and it means the Sumerians left behind an enormous archive of their own thoughts, their own laws, their own religious beliefs, written not by later interpreters, but by the people who actually believed these stories. When archaeologists in the 19th century began digging up these tablets in the mounds of ancient Mesopotamia, and when scholars in the following decades finally learned to read cuneiform script, what they found was staggering. Buried in the mud for thousands of years were stories of a great flood that destroyed humanity, stories of a garden paradise, stories of a serpent associated with wisdom, stories of gods who breathed life into clay figures, stories of a tree of life, and stories of humans denied immortality by jealous divine power. These were not stories the Sumerians borrowed from the Bible. The Bible had not been written yet. Genesis, in the form we know it today, was compiled roughly 1,000 to 1,500 years after these Sumerian tablets were baked in Mesopotamian kilns. The order of influence, in other words, runs backward from what most people assume. Whatever relationship exists between Sumerian mythology and the book of Genesis, the Sumerian material came first, by a very wide margin. The people of Mesopotamia did not worship one god. Their universe was populated by an enormous, quarrelsome, deeply human pantheon, a family of divine beings who ruled over different aspects of creation, the way a royal family might divide up provinces. At the very top of this pantheon, distant and largely inactive in the actual stories, sat An, sometimes called Anu, the god of the sky itself, the ultimate sovereign whose authority underwrote everyone else's, but who rarely got his hands dirty in the actual business of running the world. Below him were his children and grandchildren, and among these, two figures stood out above all the rest in terms of power, personality, and narrative importance. The first was Enlil, whose name means something like Lord of the Open Space, or Lord of the Wind, the god of air, storm, and command. The deity who held the Tablet of Destinies and who effectively functioned as the acting king of the gods, the one who issued decrees, who governed the world from his temple city of Nippur, and whose word was treated as law throughout the Mesopotamian religious imagination. The second was Enki, sometimes called Ea in later Akkadian and Babylonian sources, whose name means Lord of the Earth or Lord of the Below, the god of the fresh subterranean waters called the Abzu, the god of wisdom, magic, craftsmanship, and cunning, ruling from his own city of Eridu, which the Sumerians themselves regarded as the very first city ever built by human hands, the place where kingship first descended from heaven. Enki and Enlil were brothers in most tellings, sons of An, and their relationship forms the emotional and moral spine of an enormous amount of Sumerian mythology, where Enlil represents raw authority, structure, and the willingness to enforce order even through destruction. Enki represents cleverness, mercy, creativity, and a genuine, repeated affection for the humans that the gods had made. This contrast between the brothers, one who governs through command and punishment, one who governs through wisdom and quiet intervention, is the seed from which an enormous amount of later theological imagination may have grown, and it is the reason so many researchers keep returning to these two names when they try to trace the roots of Yahweh and Lucifer. Before we go further, it's worth sitting with why humans were created in the first place, according to the Sumerians, because it tells you everything about how this civilization understood its relationship with the divine. In the great Akkadian epic known as Atrahasis, one of the oldest surviving flood narratives in the world, humans do not exist because a loving creator wanted companionship or because the universe needed moral agents to test. Humans exist because the junior gods, the working-class deities who had been digging irrigation canals and doing hard physical labor for the senior gods, went on strike. They rebelled. They surrounded Enlil's house at night with their tools in hand and refused to keep working. Enlil panicked and called a council of the gods, and it was Enki, the clever one, the god of wisdom, who proposed the solution. Kill one of the rebelling gods, he suggested. Mix that god's flesh and blood with clay, and from that mixture form a new kind of being, a servant class, a worker who could take over the labor that the gods no longer wanted to perform themselves. Ninhursag, the mother goddess, carried out the actual physical creation, pinching off 14 pieces of the clay and flesh mixture and shaping them into the first 7 men and 7 women. But it was Enki's idea, Enki's plan, Enki's wisdom that made human beings possible in the first place. From the very beginning of the mythology then, Enki is cast as the architect of humanity, the god who looked at a labor problem among the gods and solved it by inventing us. This detail matters enormously for everything that follows, because it establishes a pattern that repeats again and again throughout Sumerian and Akkadian literature. When humanity needs saving, when humanity needs help, when humanity needs a champion against the harsher instincts of divine authority, it is Enki who shows up, and it is very often Enlil who represents the threat. That pattern reaches its most dramatic expression in the story of the flood. And if you already know the story of Noah, you are about to hear something that will sound eerily, almost uncomfortably familiar. In the Atrahasis epic, and in a later, even more famous retelling embedded in the Epic of Gilgamesh, humanity multiplies across the earth and grows loud. The text describes the noise of humanity as something that disturbs Enlil's sleep, an unbearable clamor rising up from the crowded cities of the world, and Enlil, the god of order and command, decides that the solution is annihilation. He does not simply want to punish humanity, he wants to erase it entirely and start over with silence. He sends plague first, and when Enki quietly intervenes to save humanity from that plague by advising a mortal man to make offerings to the right god, Enlil tries again with drought and famine, and again Enki's interference undoes the plan. Finally, in frustration, Enlil convenes the full council of the gods and makes them all swear an oath of secrecy, demanding that no god warn any human being of what is coming. What is coming is a flood so total, so complete, that it will wipe every trace of humanity from the face of the earth. And yet Enki, bound by his oath not to speak directly to any human, finds a loophole that has become one of the most famous scenes in all of ancient literature. He goes to the reed wall of the house belonging to a man named Atrahasis, or in the Sumerian version, Ziu-Sudra, or in the later Babylonian version preserved in Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim. And he speaks not to the man but to the wall itself, knowing the man is sleeping on the other side and will overhear every word. Wall, listen to me, he says. Reed hut, pay attention to my every word. Tear down your house, he tells the wall. Build a boat, abandon your possessions, save your life, and take aboard the seed of every living thing. The man builds an enormous vessel, seals it with pitch, loads it with his family, his craftsmen, and pairs of animals, and when the flood comes, sent by Enlil to erase humanity from creation, this one family survives, floating on the waters until the boat comes to rest on a mountain peak, at which point the man releases a series of birds, first a dove, then a swallow, then a raven, to determine whether the waters have receded and dry land has reappeared. If you grew up with any familiarity with the Bible at all, you just heard the plot of Genesis chapters 6 through 9 almost beat for beat. A flood sent to destroy humanity because of some transgression, a single righteous man warned in advance while everyone else is left to die, the construction of a boat sealed with pitch, the loading of paired animals, the boat coming to rest on a mountain, the release of birds to test for dry land. The parallels are not vague or impressionistic. They are structural, detailed, and specific, and this is one of the least controversial claims in all of comparative religious scholarship. Mainstream biblical scholars, not fringe theorists, not conspiracy researchers, but professors at Harvard, Oxford, and every major seminary in the world, broadly accept that the biblical flood narrative draws on a much older Mesopotamian flood tradition, whether through direct literary borrowing during the Babylonian exile of the Jewish people in the 6th century before the Common Era, or through a shared regional memory of catastrophic flooding along the Tigris and Euphrates river systems that got mythologized independently in multiple cultures across the ancient Near East. What is far more speculative and far more interesting for our purposes tonight is the question of what happens to the two gods once you map this story onto the biblical framework. In the Mesopotamian version, there are two distinct divine actors with two distinct motivations. Enlil wants total, silent destruction, viewing humanity's noise and multiplication as an offense against cosmic order. Enki wants humanity to survive, and he is willing to defy the direct command of the chief god, willing to circumvent a sworn oath through a technicality in order to preserve human life. In the biblical version, these two roles, the destroyer and the savior, the one who sends the flood and the one who warns the righteous man to build the boat, have been fused into a single character, Yahweh. The God of Genesis both decides to destroy humanity and personally instructs Noah to build the ark. He is Enlil and Enki at once, judge and savior wrapped into a single divine personality. This fusion is exactly the kind of detail that fuels the theory we are exploring tonight. Some researchers argue that as Mesopotamian religious ideas filtered westward and southward over the centuries, carried by trade, conquest, migration, and eventually the direct experience of Babylonian exile, the distinct personalities of the old Sumerian pantheon did not simply vanish. Instead, they argue, these personalities were absorbed, split, and recombined into new figures within the emerging monotheistic, and then dualistic frameworks of the ancient Near East. Under this theory, the commanding, punishing, order-obsessed aspect of Enlil, the god willing to destroy humanity wholesale for violating his sense of cosmic order, survived and intensified into the jealous, judgment-issuing god of the Hebrew Bible, a deity who floods the world, who rains fire on Sodom and Gomorrah, who commands the conquest and destruction of entire peoples in the name of covenant loyalty. Meanwhile, the wise, rebellious, humanity-loving aspect of Enki, the god who defies the chief authority to protect and empower human beings, who gives humans knowledge the ruling god wanted withheld from them, survived in a very different form, as the serpent in the garden, and eventually, many centuries later, as Lucifer, the light-bringer, the fallen angel, who dared to give humanity forbidden gifts and was cast down for it. It's a striking symmetry, and it becomes even more striking when you look closely at what Enki actually does throughout Sumerian mythology, because the flood is not the only place where he plays this exact role. Consider the myth of Adapa, one of the strangest and most theologically loaded stories to survive from ancient Mesopotamia. Adapa is a wise man, a priest of Enki's city of Eridu, and in some tellings he is described as Enki's own son, or at least his creation and protege. Enki grants Adapa immense wisdom, wisdom so complete that the god even gives him the ability to break the wing of the south wind with a curse when it capsizes his fishing boat. This act draws the attention of Anu, the supreme sky god, who summons Adapa to heaven to answer for what he has done. Before Adapa ascends, Enki gives him careful instructions on how to behave in the divine court, telling him to dress in mourning clothes to win sympathy from the two gatekeepers of heaven, and then delivering one final, critical piece of advice. When Anu offers you food and drink, Enki warns, do not eat it and do not drink it, because it will be the food and drink of death. Adapa ascends to heaven, follows every instruction perfectly, wins over the gatekeepers exactly as predicted, and stands before Anu himself. But here is the twist that has puzzled scholars for over a century. Anu, impressed by Adapa's wisdom and moved by his humility, does not offer him the food of death at all. He offers him the food of life and the water of life, the very substances that would have granted Adapa immortality, elevating a mortal man to the eternal status of the gods. But Adapa, obedient to Enki's earlier warning, refuses to eat or drink, and by refusing, he loses his one and only chance at immortality. He returns to Earth as he left it, brilliant, wise, but mortal, doomed to die like every other human being. Scholars have debated for generations whether Enki's warning was a genuine mistake, a case of a wise god simply not knowing what Anu intended to offer, or whether it was a deliberate act, a calculated decision by Enki to keep humanity wise, but mortal, keep human beings dependent on the gods rather than equal to them. Either interpretation produces an unmistakable echo of the Genesis narrative, where a serpent, associated in later Jewish and Christian tradition with deception, wisdom, and eventually with Lucifer himself, offers Eve knowledge from the tree in the garden, and where the tree of life, standing right next to the tree of knowledge, is the one fruit humanity never gets to eat. Specifically because God fears that if Adam and Eve were to eat from it, they would become immortal, become like the gods themselves. In Genesis 3, the language could not be more explicit. The Lord God said, "Behold, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. And now, lest he reach out his hand and take also of the tree of life, and eat and live forever. Therefore the Lord God sent him out of the Garden of Eden." Look at what that sentence is actually saying. It is not a metaphor. The biblical text states plainly that humanity was barred from immortality, specifically because a divine being felt threatened by the possibility of humans becoming equal to the gods, exactly the same underlying anxiety that seems to animate Anu's court in the Adapa myth, and arguably the same anxiety that runs through Enki's warning to his own protege. Whether or not you accept the theory that Enki directly evolved into the Serpent of Eden, the thematic architecture is undeniable. A wise being associated with forbidden knowledge, a mortal caught between two divine wills, and a withheld immortality guarded jealously by the ruling power of heaven. Now let's talk about the word that gives this whole theory its emotional charge: Lucifer. Most people today use the name Lucifer as a straightforward synonym for the devil, for Satan, for the ultimate embodiment of evil in the Christian tradition, but the actual history of the word is far stranger and far more revealing than that popular usage suggests. Lucifer is not a Hebrew word. It is Latin, and it means, quite literally, light bringer or morning star. It comes from the Latin words lux, meaning light, and fere, meaning to bring or to carry. The word entered Christian tradition through the Latin Vulgate translation of the Bible, produced by Jerome in the late 4th century, as a translation of a Hebrew phrase found in the book of Isaiah, chapter 14, verse 12. The original Hebrew phrase there is Hallel ben Shahar, which means something like shining one, son of the dawn, and in its original context, this passage in Isaiah is not describing a cosmic fallen angel at all. It is a taunt directed at a Babylonian king, mocking his fall from power and comparing his hubris to a Canaanite myth, likely borrowed from Ugaritic mythology, about a minor astral deity associated with the morning star, who tried to ascend above the other gods and set his throne on high, only to be cast down into the underworld for his arrogance. It was only centuries later, as early Christian theologians reinterpreted this passage allegorically, that Hallel ben Shahar, translated into Latin as Lucifer, became fused in the Christian imagination with the story of Satan's rebellion and fall from heaven, a narrative that is barely present in the Old Testament at all, and that developed much more fully in later Jewish apocalyptic literature and early Christian theology. So here is the genuinely fascinating part. The very concept embedded in the name Lucifer, a being of light, a bringer of illumination, a morning star figure who ascends toward divine status and is punished for that ascent, maps with startling precision onto Enki's core mythological identity. Enki is repeatedly described in Sumerian and Akkadian texts as the god of wisdom, the god of illumination in the sense of enlightenment and knowledge, the keeper and distributor of the me, a Sumerian word referring to the divine decrees and sacred powers that constitute the very foundations of civilization itself: kingship, priesthood, truth, justice, the art of writing, the crafts, music, sexual intercourse, the judging of disputes, and dozens of other cultural technologies. In one of the most vivid myths involving Enki, called Inanna and the God of Wisdom, the goddess Inanna travels to Enki's city of Eridu, gets him thoroughly drunk during a feast, and convinces him in his intoxicated generosity to hand over the entire collection of the me to her, loading them onto her boat and sailing away with the literal foundations of civilization before Enki, sobering up in horror, realizes what he has done and sends a flotilla of monsters to chase her down and retrieve them, though ultimately he fails, and Inanna successfully delivers these gifts of civilization to her own city of Uruk. Look at the underlying pattern here: divine gifts of knowledge and civilization, held by a wise god associated with light and understanding, escaping their intended, restricted domain and spreading out to benefit humanity more broadly. It is the Prometheus myth from Greek mythology. It is the serpent in Eden offering the fruit of knowledge, and it is, in name if not in direct genealogy, the mythic essence of what people mean when they invoke the word Lucifer as lightbringer rather than as pure evil. Let's turn now to Enlil, because if Enki supplies the template for a light-bringing, forbidden knowledge-giving figure, Enlil supplies something that looks, at least on the surface, remarkably like a template for Yahweh. Enlil's very title in Sumerian religious texts translates to something like Lord Wind or Lord of the Command, and he functions throughout Mesopotamian religion as the executive authority of the divine council, the god who holds the tablet of destinies, an object that in Mesopotamian cosmology confers the right to determine the fates of gods, kings, and nations. Whoever holds the tablet of destinies effectively rules the universe, and for most of Sumerian religious history, that god is Enlil. His temple, the Akur in the city of Nippur, was considered the literal bond between heaven and earth, and Sumerian kings across multiple dynasties sought Enlil's blessing specifically because kingship itself, in the Mesopotamian worldview, was believed to descend from heaven through Enlil's authority. He is stern. He is quick to anger. He is the god who, as we already discussed, decides to annihilate humanity because their noise disturbs him, a motivation that strikes modern readers as almost petty in its severity, a god willing to commit total genocide because he cannot sleep. And yet this same severity, this same willingness to enact sweeping, terrifying judgment against humanity for what can look from a human perspective like disproportionate reasons, runs as a consistent thread through enormous portions of the Hebrew Bible. This is a God who floods the entire world in Genesis, who rains sulfur and fire on Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 19, who sends plagues against Egypt, who commands the total destruction, down to the last man, woman, child, and animal, of cities like Jericho in the book of Joshua, who threatens and enacts covenant curses of devastating scope against his own chosen people, whenever they violate the terms of their relationship with him throughout the books of Deuteronomy, Judges, and Kings. Biblical scholars have a technical term for this pattern. The Hebrew Bible repeatedly describes Yahweh using language borrowed directly from ancient Near Eastern storm god traditions, language of thunder, of riding on clouds, of a voice that shakes mountains. Imagery that scholars widely agree draws on the same regional storm god archetype that produced deities like Enlil in Mesopotamia, Baal in Canaanite religion, and Adad or Hadad among the Amorites and Assyrians. Psalm 29, for instance, describes the voice of the Lord as breaking cedars, striking with flashes of lightning, and shaking the wilderness, language that is almost interchangeable with hymns written to Canaanite and Mesopotamian storm gods centuries earlier. There is even a linguistic thread some researchers point to, though it needs to be handled with real care because etymology in ancient Near Eastern languages is a genuinely difficult, contested field, and confident claims here often outrun what the linguistic evidence can actually support. The generic Sumerian word En means Lord or Master, and it appears as the first syllable in both Enki and Enlil's names. Separately, across the Semitic language family, which includes Akkadian, Canaanite, Ugaritic, and Hebrew, the word El, or Il, also means God or Lord, and it appears throughout the Hebrew Bible, both as a generic term for deity and as the specific name of a chief god in the broader Canaanite pantheon, a god named El, who, in texts recovered from the ancient city of Ugarit, presides as the aging, authoritative head of the pantheon, remarkably similar in function to how Anu and Enlil operate in Mesopotamian religion. The Hebrew word for God used throughout Genesis, Elohim, is grammatically a plural form built on this same root, El, and many scholars believe that the Israelite conception of a single supreme God absorbed and consolidated attributes and titles from this earlier Canaanite high god El, whose own religious profile, sovereign, patriarchal, presiding over a divine council, closely echoes the Mesopotamian Enlil archetype further east. Whether Enlil and El share a direct linguistic ancestor, or whether this is simply convergent religious evolution across cultures that shared trade routes, language families, and regional storm god traditions remains genuinely debated among historical linguists, and you should treat any confident claim of direct etymological descent with healthy skepticism. What is much less debatable is the functional and thematic overlap. A supreme, commanding, occasionally wrathful sky and storm deity who governs through decree, punishes through catastrophe, and stands at the head of a divine hierarchy is a figure that appears again and again across the ancient Near East under different names, and Yahweh, as he is depicted throughout the Hebrew Bible, fits comfortably within that same ancient regional template. This is where the theory takes its most provocative turn, the turn that gives this entire video its title. If Enlil supplies the temperament, the authority structure, and much of the narrative behavior later attributed to Yahweh, and if Enki supplies the temperament, the association with forbidden wisdom, and the pattern of defying the ruling god to benefit humanity, that later attaches itself to the figure of Lucifer, then the ancient rivalry between two Mesopotamian brothers may be the deep root system beneath one of the most consequential religious conflicts in human history, the war in heaven between God and the devil. Consider how strange this cosmic conflict actually is if you step back and think about it fresh, without the familiarity that centuries of Sunday school and popular culture have worn into it. In most later Christian theology, Lucifer's sin, the thing that gets him cast out of heaven, is often described in terms of pride, in wanting to be like the Most High, in refusing to submit to the established hierarchy of heaven. And yet the specific mythological content that later attaches to Lucifer, especially outside strict Christian orthodoxy, in Gnostic, esoteric, and occult traditions that we will discuss shortly, repeatedly casts him not simply as prideful, but specifically as an illuminator, a being who gives humanity knowledge, self-awareness, technology, or moral understanding that the ruling god wanted to withhold. That is exactly, precisely, the role Enki plays across an enormous body of Sumerian and Akkadian literature. The clever god who keeps circumventing Enlil's restrictive intentions toward humanity, whether by warning Atrahasis about the flood, by granting Adapa wisdom beyond what any other mortal possessed, or by originating the very idea of creating humans as capable, intelligent beings in the first place, rather than simple, ignorant servants. To really understand how deeply this idea of a wise, illuminating being who defies a jealous ruling god to liberate or enlighten humanity took hold in the ancient world, we have to look at Gnosticism, a diverse and fascinating collection of religious movements that flourished in the first few centuries after Christianity's founding, drawing on Jewish, Christian, Platonic, and older Near Eastern sources all at once. Gnostic texts, many of them lost for nearly 2,000 years until a cache of them was discovered in 1945 near the Egyptian village of Nag Hammadi, present a radically different picture of the Genesis creation story than the one most people grow up with. In texts like the Hypostasis of the Archons and On the Origin of the World, the God who creates the material universe and who forbids Adam and Eve from eating the fruit of knowledge is not the true, supreme, transcendent God at all. He is a lesser, flawed, often described as blind or ignorant, being called the Demiurge, frequently given the name Yaldabaoth, a jealous, arrogant deity who falsely believes himself to be the only God in existence and who deliberately keeps humanity ignorant and enslaved within the material world in order to maintain his own power. In sharp contrast, the serpent in the garden, in a significant number of these Gnostic texts, is reinterpreted entirely. Rather than a villain, the serpent becomes an instructor, sometimes explicitly associated with the divine principle of wisdom itself, personified in Gnostic cosmology as the figure Sophia, and the serpent's act of offering Adam and Eve the fruit of knowledge is reframed not as humanity's fall into sin, but as humanity's awakening, its first glimpse of true spiritual understanding, smuggled in against the wishes of a jealous, controlling, false god. Some early Christian heresiologists, church authorities writing specifically to catalog and refute what they considered dangerous heresies, describe entire Gnostic sects, including groups called the Ophites and the Gnossans, whose very names derive from the Greek and Hebrew words for serpent, who explicitly venerated the serpent of Eden as a liberating, enlightening figure, rather than a tempter toward evil. This is genuine, documented, ancient religious history, not modern speculation. It shows that within a few centuries of Christianity's founding, some communities of believers were already independently arriving at a framework that inverts the standard Genesis morality, casting the creator god of the material world as flawed, jealous, and controlling, and casting the serpent, the bringer of knowledge, as a positive, liberating figure. You can see immediately how comfortably this Gnostic framework maps onto the Enki and Enlil dynamic we've been tracing throughout the Sumerian material. An authoritative, sometimes harsh ruling god who wants to keep humanity limited and controlled, and a wiser, subversive counterpart who keeps smuggling forbidden knowledge and capability to human beings against that ruling god's wishes. It's important to say clearly that no surviving Gnostic text explicitly names Enki or Enlil, and there is no direct documentary proof of a chain of religious transmission running from Sumerian temple hymns all the way to Egyptian Gnostic communities writing in Coptic many centuries later. What we have instead is a repeating mythic pattern, sometimes called an archetype by scholars of comparative religion, that seems to surface again and again across the ancient Near East and the Mediterranean world. A controlling sky father figure, and a rebellious, illuminating counterpart who suffers for defying him. You see versions of this pattern in the Greek myth of Prometheus, punished eternally by Zeus for stealing fire and giving it to humanity. You see it in the Mesopotamian dynamic between Enlil and Enki. You see it in the Gnostic reworking of the Genesis narrative. And many modern researchers argue you see it in the developing figure of Lucifer within later Jewish and Christian tradition, a being increasingly associated, especially outside strict Orthodox theology, with illumination, forbidden knowledge, and defiance of an authoritarian heavenly ruler. No discussion of this topic would be complete without addressing the man whose work, more than anyone else's, popularized the idea that the Sumerian gods were literal, physical beings connected to humanity's origins. Zecharia Sitchin. Sitchin was a journalist and self-taught researcher, not a trained Assyriologist or historical linguist, who published a series of books beginning in 1976 with The 12th Planet, arguing that the Anunnaki, the term Mesopotamian texts used to describe the broader family of gods, including Enki, Enlil, Anu, and their relatives, were not mythological beings at all, but flesh and blood extraterrestrials from a supposed undiscovered planet in our solar system, arriving on Earth hundreds of thousands of years ago to mine gold and genetically engineering early hominids into modern humans specifically to serve as a labor force. Under Sitchin's interpretation, Enki becomes the chief geneticist of this alien expedition, the literal creator of the human species through direct biological intervention, while Enlil becomes the harsh military commander who repeatedly wants to destroy or restrict the human beings his brother engineered, still hoping to prevent them from becoming too capable or too independent. Sitchin's book sold millions of copies and became foundational texts for the modern ancient astronaut movement, influencing everything from popular television programming to countless websites and forums dedicated to alternative history. It is worth being completely honest with you about where his work stands academically. Professional Assyriologists, linguists, and historians of the ancient Near East have overwhelmingly rejected Sitchin's translations and interpretations as fundamentally unsound, arguing that he consistently mistranslated Sumerian and Akkadian vocabulary, invented astronomical claims about a non-existent planet with no basis in the cuneiform record, and built an elaborate theory on foundations that specialists in these ancient languages do not recognize as accurate readings of the source texts. This is not a minor academic quibble. It is close to a consensus rejection from the entire relevant scholarly field. And yet Sitchin's cultural influence on how millions of people today first encounter the names Enki and Enlil is undeniable, and it is impossible to discuss the modern popular theory that Enki is Lucifer without acknowledging that Sitchin's alien mythology is the soil in which much of this theory first took root and spread. Let's dig a little deeper into Enki's symbolism because there is a specific visual and iconographic thread here that deserves attention on its own. Enki is consistently associated in Mesopotamian art and text with serpents and with intertwined serpent imagery. His symbol includes a goatfish hybrid representing his dominion over the Abzu, the primordial freshwater ocean beneath the earth, but he is also linked, through his connection to healing, magic, and the god Ningish Zida, to serpent and dragon iconography that some scholars believe may be an ancestor of the medical caduceus symbol still used today, two serpents intertwined around a staff. Ningish Zida, whose name means Lord of the Good Tree, is described in Sumerian sources as a throne-bearer and gatekeeper associated with the underworld and with healing, is closely linked to Enki's household, and is depicted in Mesopotamian art as a serpent deity or as a figure whose emblem consists of intertwined snakes. Whether or not this specific iconographic line runs directly to the caduceus of Greek mythology's Hermes, and scholars are divided on that question, it establishes something important for our purposes. Serpent symbolism was already deeply, structurally embedded in the religious world surrounding Enki and his household many centuries before a serpent appears in the Garden of Eden, offering forbidden fruit. When later biblical authors reached for a symbol to represent a cunning, semi-divine being who offers forbidden knowledge in defiance of God's command, they were drawing on a regional symbolic vocabulary in which serpents were already strongly associated with wisdom, healing, immortality, and the specific mythic household of the Mesopotamian god of wisdom and fresh water. The serpent in Eden did not appear out of nowhere. It emerged from a Near Eastern symbolic landscape that had been saturated with serpent imagery, much of it tied to gods like Enki and Ningishzida for thousands of years before Genesis reached its final written form. There is also a broader mythological pattern worth setting alongside all of this, because the Enki and Enlil dynamic is far from unique in world mythology, and seeing it as part of a larger family of similar stories helps clarify what we might actually be looking at. In Greek mythology, Prometheus, a titan associated with foresight and craft, steals fire from Zeus and gives it to humanity against the will of the ruling sky god, and is punished eternally, chained to a rock, while an eagle devours his liver every single day, only to have it regrow and be devoured again. In Norse mythology, Loki, a trickster figure with complicated, shifting loyalties to the ruling gods of Asgard, repeatedly causes chaos that both harms and paradoxically benefits the gods and sometimes humanity, and is ultimately bound in punishment for his defiance. In Egyptian mythology, Set murders and dismembers his brother Osiris, a god associated with civilization, agriculture, and the afterlife, in a struggle for cosmic and political authority that echoes in a very different key the tension between a civilizing, life-giving deity and a more destructive, power-consolidating rival. Across an enormous range of unrelated cultures, separated by oceans, centuries, and totally distinct languages, we find some version of the same underlying story: a wise, generous, humanity-favoring figure who defies or is destroyed by a more powerful, authoritarian ruling god, precisely because that wise figure gave humanity something: fire, knowledge, civilization, immortality, that the ruling power wanted to withhold. Comparative mythologists have long debated why this pattern recurs so consistently. Some argue it reflects a genuine, ancient shared inheritance, ideas that spread through very early human migration and cultural contact long before recorded history began. Others argue it reflects something more psychological, a pattern human societies tend to independently generate because it captures a real and recurring tension within human experience itself: the tension between authority that demands obedience and stability, and curiosity that demands growth and risk. Whichever explanation you find more persuasive, the Enki and Enlil story fits comfortably within this much larger, cross-cultural pattern, which should make us pause before assuming that any single, direct genealogical line connects Enki specifically and exclusively to Lucifer, as opposed to Enki being one expression, among many across world mythology, of an idea that seems to recur wherever humans have told stories about gods and about themselves. Now, having laid out the case as strongly and fairly as it can be made, we owe it to the subject, and to you, to take a hard, honest look at the problems with this theory, because a good researcher does not just build the most exciting possible narrative and stop there. The first and most serious problem is chronological and cultural distance. The core Sumerian myths we have discussed, the creation of humanity, the flood, the story of Adapa, were composed and circulated primarily between roughly 2100 and 1600 years before the Common Era, in a language, Sumerian, that had already become a dead liturgical language by the time many of these texts were copied down by Akkadian and Babylonian scribes. The Book of Genesis, in the form scholars believe it reached, was likely compiled and finalized somewhere between the 10th and 5th centuries before the Common Era, drawing on earlier oral and written traditions, but reaching something like its current textual form roughly 1,000 years or more after the peak of classical Sumerian religious literature. The concept of Lucifer as a cosmic fallen angel, as we've already discussed, does not fully crystallize until Christian theology develops it in the centuries after Jesus, meaning well over 2,000 years, separate the earliest Enki texts from the fully developed Lucifer mythology many popular theories compare him to. 2,000 years is an enormous span of time, longer than the entire history of Christianity itself, and any claim of direct, traceable influence across that distance needs to grapple honestly with just how much cultural transformation, reinterpretation, and independent invention could have occurred along the way. A second serious problem is the reliability of some of the popular sources that first carried this theory into mainstream awareness, particularly Zecharia Sitchin's work, which, as we discussed, is not regarded by professional linguists and Assyriologists as an accurate reading of the cuneiform record. When a theory's popular foundation rests significantly on mistranslated or invented material, that does not automatically make every claim built on top of it false, but it does mean each individual claim needs to be checked back against the actual, professionally translated primary sources rather than taken on faith from popularizers. And a great deal of what circulates online about Enki, Enlil, and their supposed direct identities as Lucifer and Yahweh has not been checked that carefully. There is also a complicating detail that rarely makes it into the popular, tidy version of this theory, and it is worth sitting with precisely because it resists easy narrative packaging. In the Sumerian myth known as Enki and Ninhursag, Enki himself, not a serpent, not a tempter figure, but Enki, the supposed proto-Lucifer, wanders into the paradise garden of Dilmun, a pure, sacred, disease-free land, and eats 8 sacred plants that Ninhursag has grown, plants he was expressly forbidden from touching. Furious at this violation, Ninhursag curses Enki, and he falls gravely ill, suffering pain and sickness spreading through 8 different parts of his body, one for each plant he consumed, until Ninhursag is eventually persuaded to relent and heals him, creating 8 separate healing deities, one for each afflicted body part, to restore him. Look closely at what this story actually contains: a paradise garden, forbidden plants that must not be eaten, a transgression against that prohibition, and a resulting curse of sickness and suffering as punishment. That is structurally the Genesis narrative of forbidden fruit in a paradise garden, except in this Sumerian version, it is Enki himself playing the role of Adam, the one who eats what he should not eat and suffers the consequences, not the role of the serpent who tempts someone else into doing it. This detail matters enormously for how seriously we should take the clean, symmetrical version of the theory presented in so many online videos and articles, where Enki is simply and consistently the wise, giving, Lucifer-like figure across every myth. The actual textual record is messier than that. Enki plays the forbidden fruit eater in one story and the wisdom-giving liberator in another. Enlil plays the humanity-destroying tyrant in one story, but is also, in a large number of other Sumerian hymns and royal inscriptions, praised straightforwardly as a beneficent, life-sustaining, agriculturally generous god whose blessing brings prosperity to the land, credited with organizing the world's order in ways ancient worshippers experienced as protective rather than purely punitive. Mesopotamian religion, in other words, was not built around a clean moral binary of one good god and one evil god the way later Zoroastrian, Jewish, and Christian dualism increasingly came to be. It was a religion of complex, multidimensional divine personalities capable of great generosity and great destructiveness within the very same figure, and flattening Enki into pure light and Enlil into pure tyranny does some genuine violence to how the Sumerians themselves actually understood and worshipped these gods. So where does that leave us, honestly, after walking through all of this evidence together? The most responsible answer, and probably the least satisfying one, if you came here hoping for a clean, confirmed conspiracy, is that the relationship between Enki, Enlil, Lucifer, and Yahweh is almost certainly not a matter of direct one-to-one identity, where Enki simply is Lucifer wearing a different name, and Enlil simply is Yahweh in an earlier costume. What the evidence much more strongly supports is something both less sensational and, in its own way, more genuinely fascinating: a shared, ancient, Near Eastern religious and mythological inheritance, a common well of stories, images, and theological anxieties, flood narratives, forbidden knowledge, paradise gardens, jealous ruling gods, wise defiant helpers, that different cultures across Mesopotamia, Canaan, and later Judea and the broader Mediterranean world drew from, reshaped, and recombined according to their own evolving theological needs over the course of more than 2,000 years. The god the ancient Israelites called Yahweh absorbed language, imagery, and narrative patterns from earlier regional storm and sky god traditions, of which Enlil is one of the oldest and best documented examples we have, without Yahweh being reducible to Enlil alone, or being a simple continuation of a single unbroken religious lineage. The figure later Christian tradition came to call Lucifer absorbed across an equally long and complicated development, imagery of illumination, forbidden wisdom, and defiance of divine authority that echoes, whether through direct cultural transmission, independent human pattern generation, or some combination of both, the role Enki plays across a large body of much older Mesopotamian literature. The theory that Enki is Lucifer, taken as a literal direct equation, outruns what the historical and textual evidence can currently support, but the theory that Enki represents one of the oldest, clearest surviving expressions of an archetype, the wise, defiant illuminator who suffers for empowering humanity against the wishes of a stricter ruling authority, an archetype that many centuries later crystallized into the figure of Lucifer within Christian tradition, is a genuinely defensible, historically grounded observation, one that mainstream scholars of comparative religion and ancient Near Eastern studies would recognize as a legitimate area of academic interest, even if they would resist the more sensational, direct identity framing that dominates popular treatments of this subject online. There's one more angle worth considering before we close, and it has less to do with archaeology and more to do with why this theory resonates so powerfully with so many people today, regardless of how the academic details eventually settle. Human beings have always told stories about the tension between authority and knowledge, between the safety of obedience and the risk of curiosity, between a power that wants to keep us small and a power that wants to help us grow, even at great cost. That tension did not begin in Mesopotamia, and it did not end in the Garden of Eden. It runs through the entire history of human thought, from Prometheus chained to his rock, to Adam and Eve cast out of paradise, to every modern story about scientists who unlock forces they cannot fully control, to every personal experience any of us have had of choosing a harder, more honest truth over a more comfortable, protected ignorance. Part of why the Enki and Enlil story feels so alive today, more than 4,000 years after it was first pressed into wet clay, is that it is really a story about that tension, dressed in the oldest religious language human civilization has left us. Whether or not Enki is, in some literal genealogical sense, the distant mythological ancestor of Lucifer, and whether or not Enlil is the distant ancestor of Yahweh, the deeper pattern both of these figures represent, the wise helper who defies restrictive authority to empower others, and the stern authority who believes that restriction and order are themselves a form of protection and love, is a pattern human beings clearly cannot stop telling stories about, because in one form or another, we are still living inside it. So is Enki Lucifer. Based on everything the actual clay tablets, the actual translated texts, and the actual scholarly record can tell us, the honest answer is that we cannot prove it, not in the way you could prove a scientific hypothesis or a documented historical event. What we can say with real confidence is that the oldest religious literature human beings ever wrote down already contains, in startlingly clear form, the same theological tensions, the same character types, and in some cases the same specific narrative beats that would later define the moral universe of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. A God who creates humanity and then wants to destroy it. A God who defies that decision to save a single righteous family, a paradise garden with forbidden knowledge inside it, a wise figure punished for offering that knowledge anyway, a serpent wound through it all, symbol of healing in one telling, symbol of temptation in another. These are not modern inventions. They were already ancient when Abraham, according to the biblical account, is said to have left the very same region of Mesopotamia where these stories were first told, carrying, whether he or his descendants knew it or not, the deep imprint of a mythology that had already been circulating for well over 1,000 years. Whatever you decide to believe about Enki, about Enlil, about Yahweh, and about Lucifer, one thing seems very hard to deny after looking closely at the evidence. The story of a divided divine family, one half generous and illuminating, one half authoritative and severe, locked in a long argument over how much freedom, how much knowledge, and how much power human beings deserve to have, is one of the oldest stories our species has ever told about itself, and we are, whether we realize it or not, still telling it. Before we close, there is one more thread that deserves attention because it may be the single strongest documented scholarly parallel in this entire discussion, stronger even than the flood story, and it connects directly to a different but closely related strand of biblical tradition, the story of the Watchers and the Nephilim. In Genesis chapter 6, just before the flood narrative begins, there is a strange, brief, almost throwaway passage describing the sons of God seeing that the daughters of man were beautiful, taking wives from among them, and producing offspring called the Nephilim, described as mighty men of old, men of renown. The passage is famously cryptic in the canonical Bible, only a few verses long, but a much fuller version of this story survives in the Book of Enoch, an ancient Jewish text that did not make it into the standard Hebrew Bible or most Christian canons, though it is still considered scripture within Ethiopian Orthodox Christianity, and it was clearly known and respected by many Jewish and early Christian communities in the centuries around the turn of the era. In the Book of Enoch, this brief Genesis passage is expanded into a full narrative about a group of angels called Watchers, led by a figure named Shemihaza, or, in another prominent tradition within the same text, by a figure named Azazel, who descend to earth, take human wives, and, critically for our discussion, teach humanity a whole range of forbidden knowledge and technologies: metallurgy and the forging of weapons, the making of jewelry and cosmetics, sorcery, astrology, the cutting of roots for medicine, and the interpretation of omens. This forbidden instruction is treated in the text as a serious transgression, corrupting humanity and filling the earth with violence, and it is explicitly named as one of the central reasons God decides to send the flood in the first place. The Watchers are punished savagely for this act of teaching, bound and cast into darkness to await final judgment. Now compare that directly to a genuine, well-documented strand of Mesopotamian religious tradition concerning figures called the Apkallu, a group of 7 semi-divine sages associated closely with Enki, sent by him in the mythic period before the flood specifically to teach humanity the foundations of civilization, the arts, writing, temple building, agriculture, and the various crafts and technologies that made urban life possible. Mesopotamian king lists and ritual texts describe these Apkallu sages as instructors of humanity operating in the antediluvian, pre-flood era associated with wisdom, with Enki's city of Eridu, and with a kind of forbidden, or at least extraordinary, boundary-crossing transmission of civilizing knowledge from the divine realm into the human one. Several serious scholars of ancient Near Eastern religion, including researchers who have published specifically on this comparison in peer-reviewed academic contexts, have noted the striking structural resemblance between the Mesopotamian Apkallu tradition, semi-divine beings who descend before a great flood to teach humanity forbidden or extraordinary knowledge, and the Anunnaki Watcher tradition, angelic beings who descend before a great flood to teach humanity forbidden or extraordinary knowledge. This is not a fringe internet theory in this particular case. It is a documented, published line of comparative research within mainstream biblical and Assyriological scholarship, precisely because the parallel is so specific and so structurally exact that it is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. And once again, tellingly, the figure standing behind the transmission of this dangerous, civilization-building knowledge in the Mesopotamian tradition is Enki, the same god who warns Atrahasis about the flood, the same god who grants Adapa his wisdom, the same god whose entire mythological identity centers on giving humanity capabilities that a stricter, more controlling divine authority would rather have withheld. This layered pattern, appearing across the flood narrative, the Adapa myth, the Apkallu and Watcher traditions, and the broader forbidden knowledge theme running through Eden, builds a cumulative case that is genuinely difficult to wave away as pure coincidence, even after we've applied every reasonable dose of scholarly caution. It does not prove that Enki literally is Lucifer in some unbroken chain of direct religious identity, but it does show, again and again, from multiple independent angles and across multiple different bodies of ancient literature, the same recurring divine role, a being associated with wisdom, with illumination, with civilization, and with a willingness to defy stricter divine authority in order to hand humanity something it was not supposed to have yet. Whatever name you eventually decide fits that role best, Enki, Prometheus, the Serpent, the Watchers, or Lucifer himself, The role clearly predates every single one of those names individually, and the Sumerians, as far as our current evidence can tell us, were the first civilization on Earth to write it down. Conclusion. When you step back from everything we've walked through tonight, the flood, the garden, the forbidden fruit, the serpent, the watchers, the wise God, and the wrathful God locked in the same divine family, one thing becomes very hard to unsee. Long before there was a Bible, long before there was a Lucifer or a Yahweh by those names, there was already a story being told on the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates about two brothers who could not agree on how much freedom humanity deserved. One wanted control, silence, and obedience. The other wanted humanity to know things, to grow, to survive even when the rules said it shouldn't. That argument didn't end when Sumerian civilization faded into the sand. It got carried forward, reshaped generation after generation, culture after culture, language after language, until it became the biggest religious story on Earth. The war between God and the devil, between order and knowledge, between a jealous heaven and a curious humanity caught in the middle. Is Enki Lucifer? Is Enlil Yahweh? The clay tablets can't give us a signed confession. What they can give us is the oldest known draft of a question we are apparently still asking 4,000 years later, every single time we choose between staying safe inside the boundaries we're given or reaching for the thing on the other side of them. Maybe that's the real answer this myth has been offering all along, not a name, but a mirror. So I'll leave you with the same question the Sumerians left carved in clay. When knowledge and obedience pull you in opposite directions, which god do you follow? Let me know what you think in the comments, and if this kind of deep dive into the roots of religion and mythology is something you want more of, subscribe, because we've barely scratched the surface of what the oldest stories on Earth still have to tell us. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. I love hearing from you. Check out more videos on the screen, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.